In 2016, Donald Trump sold himself as the savior of the American people. Pointing at an obviously broken system, he created the idea that he was the only one who could drain the swamp, exposing the corruption of the government and empowering the other half of the country. And as a result, he built the biggest populist movement in modern American history, all on the back of one promise: make America great again. But then, after 2 years in office, he was faced with the ultimate opportunity.
Billionaire financier Jeffery Epstein has been arrested. He was taken into custody overnight at a New Jersey airport.
Out of nowhere, a somewhat forgotten 10-year-old sex crime case was blown wide open by a journalist in Miami, alleging that the mysterious billionaire who had been convicted of trafficking young girls at his mansion in Palm Beach was far more complicated than originally thought, involving a much longer list of co-conspirators than anyone was aware of, with fingers pointed at a list of accomplices and clients that included the British royal family, former presidents, world-famous intellectuals, and more. But what no one expected was for the case to blow up in Donald Trump's face. Because the only problem was that Trump himself had a long personal history with Epstein, a documented friendship that went back decades. And as more evidence from Jeffrey Epstein's life was revealed, it would start to look like he and Donald Trump were much closer than most people had ever imagined. So even now, the story just doesn't die. Because if the rules of society don't apply to the people who make them, we have to ask ourselves, do we even still live in a society at all? Or is the American dream a story that we tell ourselves at night? I'm Philip, you're watching Volksgeist, and this is the story of the friendship between the president and the most horrific pedophile to have ever been exposed, and what that means for all of us. In the late 1980s, New York was a city of extremes. At the same time as the rate of violence and murder was shooting through the roof, it was also becoming a playground for the world's ultra-wealthy. Broad tax cuts and deregulation meant that the finance industry was growing at a rate that had never been seen before. Corporate raiders, stockbrokers, and CEO were running the town. At the same time, real estate speculation exploded, turning New York's skyline into a luxury brand. The nightlife, entertainment, and consumerism was growing to a level unrivaled anywhere else on Earth. The film Wall Street would depict the cultural attitude filling New York at the time as a manic sense of ambition where greed would not only be seen as acceptable but celebrated. The monologue where Michael Douglas says, "Greed, for a lack of a better word, is good," would be considered to be one of the greatest film quotes of the era.
Greed, for lack of a better word, is good.
It didn't just memorialize a movie. It defined an entire era when even mainstream culture would come to validate, glorify, and worship the love of money for its own sake. Unprecedented consumerism and materialism, bold fashion, exotic cars, lavish parties, crazy lifestyles, the rise of corporate culture. This was a time that would serve as the basis for legendary movies like American Psycho and Wolf of Wall Street, both of which are more social commentary than they were fantasy. But more than movies, there would be a number of people who would make themselves infamous, building monuments to their own egos and ambition throughout the city, turning their New York exploits into the subject of not just local interest, but infiltrating all the way into media and celebrity culture around the world. No longer would money hide in boardrooms or offices. Now it was plastered on magazine covers, depicted in films, paraded down Fifth Avenue, and celebrated as the city itself became a temple to excess. Armand Hammer, Calvin Klein, Michael Milken, Steve Rubell, there were many personalities that would define this era of excess. But there was one who would check every box. Donald Trump, a flashy young real estate developer, had turned himself into a mythical creature. He splashed his name in gold across skyscrapers, posed larger than life on magazine covers, turned New York into his own personal stage, and with every tabloid headline and photo op, he sold a story of success that was unlike anything mainstream culture had seen before, redefining what it meant to be rich and famous. But speaking of being rich and famous, I did want to let everyone know that the shirt I'm wearing in this video, I designed and embroidered it myself, and it's on sale now. I think it's pretty obvious what the meaning is here. Our world is being completely sold out to rich people who have no regard for human life or right or wrong, and it's probably the most morbid, grim YouTube merch that's ever existed. But if you want to support a completely independent channel that's not owned by any media conglomerate and doesn't use AI to do any of our content, you can do that right now. More importantly than that, by buying these, you're helping us continue to make stuff like this and hopefully dive deeper than most people will and tell stories that are hard to get out there in the world today. So yeah, we have free shipping on these. You can buy them at spiritworld.store. That's my website, spiritworld.store. I really appreciate the support. Thank you guys for helping us continue to do what we do. Donald Trump wasn't born into the Manhattan elite. He wasn't at all self-made either, growing up in a 23-room mansion in Queens, but his family's money was far from glamorous in the sense we would think of it now. His father, Fred, Fred had built thousands of middle-class apartments after the Great Depression, using government contracts from the city to make tens of millions of dollars by the time his son Donald was born in 1946. But Donald would make it his mission to take that relatively uninteresting legacy of apartment buildings and construct a world of glamour, ambition, and excess, taking his father's fortune and turning it into glittering towers, cover stories, movie cameos, and a personal brand big enough to dominate even New York City.
Donald Trump, as I say, is just 33 years old. He took his father's rather modest by current standards real estate empire in Brooklyn and expanded it considerably.
Fast forward to the late 80s, and by the time Donald Trump was 40 years old, he had become the human manifestation of the ambition and greed that defined the era. He stamped his name on his skyscrapers in big, bold letters.
Come and be dazzled. Trump Tower.
He owned casinos along the Jersey Shore. He bought the Plaza Hotel. He opened Trump Tower on Fifth Avenue. But more than that, he had turned his business into a brand which in itself became his business. His marriages and divorces, his sense of style, his media appearances, his quotes, it all became content.
Mr. and Mrs. Donald Trump. It's the Donald! Oh my God!
His blend of business and entertainment made him not just the most famous man in New York, but a symbol of a new era where celebrity and money could meet and create a completely new definition of the American dream. Not one of quiet hard work or modest success, but a dream of visibility, spectacle, and greed. Trump was the pioneer of this new era in 1980s New York. He was loud, selfish, and proud of it. He wasn't famous because of virtue, skill, or talent, but because he had money and wasn't afraid to say it. And truth be told, there was no one who was better at this than Donald Trump.
Donald Trump is the Hugh Hefner of the 90s.
But not everyone chasing power and money in New York would do it under neon lights and headlines. In the very same circles that Trump loudly dominated, there was another figure beginning to rise, and his name was Jeffrey Epstein. Similar to Donald Trump, Jeffrey Epstein grew up in a quiet outer borough of New York City, and like Trump, he spent the 1980s building a substantial private fortune. Although unlike Donald Trump, Jeffrey Epstein moved very quietly. Even in the finance industry where he worked, which was attracting more media attention year by year, Epstein left almost no record of his work behind him. But that didn't mean that their paths wouldn't cross anyway, and when they did, their meeting would create one of the most consequential relationships in modern American history, a connection whose true significance continues to haunt the nation decades later. In the late 80s, Palm Beach, Florida was a growing hotspot for the rich and famous to gather, party, and get away from the New York cold. It was there that Trump purchased the historic 70,000 square foot Mar-a-Lago estate in 1985. And just a couple years later, Jeffrey Epstein also happened to scoop up a 6-bedroom waterfront mansion just a mile down the road from Trump's new property. And the story goes that that's where and how they met. Two New Yorkers who both happened to buy vacation homes in a wealthy enclave in Florida where everybody knew everybody. But that isn't all they had in common. Jeffrey Epstein had a profoundly different start to his career than Donald Trump. While they did both grow up in the outer boroughs of New York in the 1960s, Epstein didn't inherit millions of dollars and a business from his father. His parents were working class, and he ended up dropping out of college in his 3rd year. In the mid-1970s, he ended up teaching at an elite private high school in Manhattan, although he would be fired from there for poor performance after just a year. But after a series of strange leaps forward, he ended up jumping to Bear Stearns, an immensely influential investment firm where he would also be fired for insider trading after just a couple more years. But by the late 1980s, Jeffrey Epstein had amassed a mysterious fortune by opening his own elite financial firm that supposedly served only clients with a fortune of $1 billion or more, even though he himself still had little to no public profile or notoriety at all. But as the 1980s ended, it became clear that the mysterious Epstein wanted to make a name for himself in the elite social scene of New York City. And so he went from being a mostly unknown banker to a permanent fixture in that world, with a big part of his new visibility actually coming from him being around the very visible Donald Trump, someone who had so many eyes on him that the media would start looking at you just for the virtue of being seen next to him. It began with typical neighborly stuff. In 1992, their first real appearance together on video comes from a party that Trump hosted where he invited NFL cheerleaders to dance and perform at Mar-a-Lago. In archived footage from NBC, in between shots of 45-year-old Donald Trump dancing his heart out in a crowd full of young models, you can see him welcoming Epstein to the party, speaking to him off to the side as they watch the cheerleaders dance. In one shot, he points to one of them and says to Epstein, "She's hot," before Epstein grins widely and laughs. Just a year later, Trump got married to Marla Maples, a television host and model from Georgia at New York's historic Plaza Hotel, which he had recently purchased. Among a long list of celebrity guests was Jeffrey Epstein, who can be spotted in a number of photos from Donald Trump's second wedding. At the grand opening of the Harley-Davidson Cafe in New York at the end of 1993, Epstein would be photographed standing next to Trump and his children Ivanka and Eric in a candid shot from the event. From 1997 to 99, there would be videos of them together at Mar-a-Lago and at Victoria's Secret Angels fashion events in New York. By the time the new century arrived, Epstein was no longer the strange man in the shadows he had once been. Seen in public often, especially with friends like Donald Trump, he started cultivating a sense of mystique that was of great interest to journalists and onlookers. A Boeing 727 parked on the tarmac with his name on it, a private island with full-time staff, the biggest house in Manhattan. If Epstein wasn't catching up to Trump, it was because he had already passed him. And so it was far too late for Epstein to remain a secret for long. Naturally, the questions arise. Who is this guy who seems to have a source of infinite wealth without anyone knowing who he is? How did he afford the largest private home in Manhattan without ever doing business in public? And how does he know all of these people? And why do they like him so much? Epstein would be the subject of profiles in New York Magazine and Vanity Fair as journalists covering the scene tried to figure out how he became so connected without ever really making a name for himself in business first. And a big part of that was his connection to people like Donald Trump. When a journalist from New York Magazine called Trump in 2002 to ask for a quote on Epstein for a piece they were working on about him, he would reportedly boom through the speakerphone to say, "I've known Jeff for 15 years. Terrific guy. He's a lot of fun to be with. It's even said that he likes beautiful women as much as I do, and many of them are on the younger side." But aside from their mentions of Epstein's obsession with being surrounded by models, journalists would write about Epstein's meetings with Bill Clinton, his friendships with entrepreneurs like Donald Trump. But ultimately, most of them would write the whole thing off as Epstein likely having less than meets the eye behind his carefully curated persona. With no real history in business or finance to explain his connections, they kind of talked about him being a complicated con man more than anything. Throughout the 2000s, he would be known for his presence in elite intellectual circles. He hosted group dinners at his Manhattan townhouse. He flew academics and technologists to conferences and to his island. He styled himself as a patron of the big questions in science. He poured millions of dollars into Harvard and MIT, and photos from the time show him shoulder to shoulder with famous researchers and philanthropists. Guest lists from his townhouse read like a who's who of science and finance. The idea was simple. Jeffrey Epstein wasn't a mysterious hedge fund banker, he was a benefactor of knowledge. But then, it all very suddenly came crashing down. Because in 2008, Jeffrey Epstein is arrested for soliciting sex from a 14-year-old girl in Palm Beach, and a year-long investigation yielded evidence of dozens of possible victims, but he ended up pleading guilty to just one, and he was sentenced to 18 months in prison. At the time, the case didn't make national headlines, but it did make Epstein a social outcast, or at least it should have. When he was released 6 months early, though, Epstein's social life largely went right back to normal. Not only did many of his friends stay around him, in fact, he only gained even more. His friends in the scientific community would defend him. His famous celebrity dinner parties resumed unchanged. People like Woody Allen, Chelsea Handler, Prince Andrew, they'd all stay by his side. After prison, he would go on to host meetings with Bill Gates. He would work with former Israeli and South American politicians. For a convicted sex offender, his reputation seemed basically untouched. In comparison to the people who would vouch for him, his outspoken critics were nowhere to be found. And at the same time, the details of the Epstein case had never quite been picked up by mainstream media or national consciousness. With his case having taken place before mass adoption of social media, the average person simply didn't know much about Epstein or his crimes. But at the end of 2018, that would change when Julie Brown of the Miami Herald broke a 3-part story called Perversion of Justice that revealed a truth that had been almost completely hidden about the Epstein case. And that was that not only did Epstein likely commit far more crimes than he was ever charged with, but that there was a year-long FBI investigation that ended up getting swept under the rug while Epstein walked away with an absurdly lenient plea deal. While Epstein spent 13 months in a Florida prison in 2008, he was allowed to have his own private housing wing, private security, an unlocked cell, work release where he could leave the jail all day, every day unsupervised, and all of this was after federal prosecutors allowed him to write up his own plea deal for crimes that should have carried a federal sentence measured not in months, but in decades. The story was an immediate bombshell. In fact, it made such an impact that after just a couple months, and after taking a closer look at the circumstances surrounding Epstein's original plea deal and incarceration, federal prosecutors realized that not only was his case originally handled unlawfully, but that there was a mountain of new evidence and victims available that they could build an entirely new case on top of. And so on July 6, 2019, at Teterboro Airport in New Jersey, Jeffrey Epstein is arrested by the FBI upon returning from a trip to Paris. While searching his home, agents found thousands of photographs of his child victims locked away in safes behind cash and diamonds. He was denied bail, sent to a notoriously rough jail in New York City, and for the first time in his adult life, Jeffrey Epstein was not in control. The stories of Epstein's time in jail would center around desperate bids for some kind of power over his environment. He would exploit the right to an attorney, paying lawyers to sit silently in conference rooms for 8 hours a day to avoid his cell, while he bought every snack out of the jail vending machines over and over, only to throw it all in the trash. But this time, there would be so many eyes on him, so much attention, that there was no way he was getting any kind of sweetheart plea deal or house arrest. Jeffrey Epstein became one of the most hated men in the entire world, and his trial was gearing up to be one of the most notable and frenzied in modern history. It wasn't just about what he had done. It was about all of his rich friends, his powerful connections, and the question of how did it get covered up, who had known, and who had been helping him. But early one morning in August of 2019, just about a month after he had been arrested, news broke that Jeffrey Epstein had been found dead in his cell.
Some breaking news right now. Disgraced financier Jeffrey Epstein has taken his own life while he was behind bars here in New York City.
And in an instant, the fabric holding America together was torn to shreds. It wasn't about Epstein's death. It was about the collapse of the idea that justice could ever be equal. A man who had lived at the highest possible level of money, politics, and celebrity was gone before he could stand trial and be forced to tell exactly what he had done and who he had done it with. To millions of people around the world, it was confirmation that the system was rotten to its core, that the rich and powerful could make even the most notorious scandal on earth disappear in the blink of an eye. After Epstein's arrest, it had been pretty clear to most people that he probably wasn't working alone. Now it was clear that he had been working with someone so powerful that they could have him killed at the drop of a hat. And in the weeks and months that followed, almost every single person who was known to have been associated with Epstein would have the finger pointed at them. The Clinton family, Bill Gates, Prince Andrew of England. It was like all of them had been splashed in the face with bright red ink. And many of the people in Epstein's network didn't make a clean break. Ghislaine Maxwell, his longtime partner and recruiter, was arrested in 2020 after a manhunt. She was convicted of sex trafficking and sentenced to 20 years in prison.
Ghislaine Maxwell, she's described as Epstein's one-time girlfriend and business partner. She's now going to face child sex trafficking-related charges.
Prince Andrew, the son of Queen Elizabeth II, had been facing accusations from Epstein victims for years, even before his second arrest. And eventually, in 2022, he settled a lawsuit out of court for reported $12 million. While he was never charged with a crime, his public role in the English monarchy, his military titles, and all of his royal funding was taken away, casting Prince Andrew to live in the shadow of his crimes for the rest of his life.
And today it's been announced that Prince Andrew will be stepping away from all of his 230 charity patronages.
Notable Democrat politicians and donors like Bill Clinton and Bill Gates would also be plagued by questions around their involvement for years.
Any comments on the alleged allegation of your connection with Jeffrey Epstein? No.
Les Wexner, notable financial client of Epstein and decades-long best friend who had once signed power of attorney over to Epstein, ended up stepping down from his role as CEO of Victoria's Secret and Bath & Body Works after Epstein's death.
A deal has been reached to sell Victoria's Secret and for Les Wexner to step down as chairman of L Brands.
And perhaps most notable was the arrest of Jean-Luc Brunel, the high-profile modeling agent who had long been known to be a link in the trafficking network that procured children for Epstein and his clients to abuse. Even as far back as the first FBI investigation of Epstein in the mid-2000s that ended up getting covered up by Alex Acosta, they knew that Epstein was having kids flown in from Paris. And so at the end of 2020, Jean-Luc Brunel was arrested by French National Police while trying to escape the country on a flight to Senegal, although he would eventually avoid sentencing when he hung himself in his jail cell a year later.
Former modeling agent linked to Jeffrey Epstein was found dead in his prison cell this morning.
Many of Epstein's partners and friends would be convicted, disgraced, or even turn up dead the same way he did. There's no doubt about it. Epstein was at the center of a circle of rich and powerful pedophiles. Yet one relationship would stand out above the others, a connection that still refuses to fade. Donald Trump had political aspirations for decades. Even in the late 1980s, he saw a future where a celebrity entrepreneur like himself could be viewed as a serious politician.
This sounds like political presidential talk to me, and I know people have talked to you about whether or not you want to run. Would you ever?
Probably not.
You've said that you could do a better job at negotiating an arms control agreement with the Soviets than some of these professionals who've been trying to do it for years.
I didn't say me, Mike. I said somebody has to do it. If it were me, that'd be fine. I could do it.
In 1988, he approached Republican political strategist Lee Atwater to ask if he could be put into consideration to be George H.W. Bush's running mate, a request that Bush and his team reportedly found strange and unbelievable. After that, Trump would flip-flop between Democrat and Republican for years, before announcing at Trump Tower in June of 2015 that he would be running for President of the United States with the slogan, "Make America Great Again." Attacking issues like illegal immigration, Islamic terrorism, the rising national debt, the offshoring of American jobs, Donald Trump didn't hide from the fact that he had no political experience. In fact, for Trump's supporters, that was part of his appeal. The idea was that because he wasn't a politician, because he was rich, he could do what no one else could. He couldn't be bought. And that's why, when 2 years into his first term, when Jeffrey Epstein was hauled into federal custody and the mask was ripped off of one of the most shocking criminal sexual abuse scandals in modern history, and with people realizing that Epstein didn't just act alone, but that he was acting with some of the world's highest elites, all eyes snapped to Donald Trump. If anyone was going to drain the swamp, this was going to be the moment. Reporters would press Trump about his own connections to Epstein, but his answers were blatantly evasive. He would say, "I was never a fan of that guy." He would say that they hadn't spoken in many years, but that was it. He didn't offer an explanation. He didn't offer more evidence. It didn't even feel like he was the president who ran on draining the swamp. In fact, it felt like nothing but standard political theater. Deny, deflect, move on. Hope the world forgets.
Well, I knew him like everybody in Palm Beach knew him. I mean, people in Palm Beach knew him. He was a fixture in Palm Beach. I was not a fan of his. That I can tell you. I was not a fan of his. So
there was no document dump, no clear account of the Epstein case from the White House. They offered nothing. But that evasion only made the world more curious. So as time went on, the world wouldn't forget as easy as President Trump seemed to want us to. And so the Epstein case doesn't just disturb the nation the way that a serial killer or a terror attack might. It became essentially a dumpster fire sitting on the front steps of the White House. And it was one that would be nearly impossible to put out, as millions of people started to see the slogan of draining the swamp as nothing but an empty promise. Or, even more likely, that it could be part of the cover-up itself. And so what at first looked like just a couple of glossy tabloid shots of two rich New York guys, it hardened into a decades-long timeline. Trump and Epstein weren't just passing acquaintances, they were fixtures in each other's lives. With the president himself now under the microscope thanks to his own evasive behavior, a barrage of old secrets, evidence, and accusations start to resurface. But during Ghislaine Maxwell's trial in 2021, flight logs from Epstein's jet showed that Trump would ride on board no less than 8 times in the late 90s, regularly carpooling between their mansions together on the very same aircraft that was dubbed the Lolita Express by Caribbean locals who witnessed Epstein returning to his private island many times with disturbingly young girls in between regular visits from princes and presidents. Trump says, "I was not a fan of his," but when Epstein's little black book was made public, it included 14 phone numbers for Trump and his family, including contact info for his wife, his house staff, and his security team. Trump would snap at reporters. "Are you still talking about this creep?" You would describe someone you see at the grocery store in your neighborhood.
Are you still talking about Jeffrey Epstein? This guy's been talked about for years. And are people still talking about this guy, this creep? That is unbelievable. It just seems like a desecration.
Some evidence was even hidden in plain sight. The infamous 2002 quote from New York Magazine made headlines again all throughout the last year. Today, Trump says that Epstein was an acquaintance he never particularly liked, but 20 years ago, he acts like they were best friends, saying, "I've known Jeff for 15 years. He's a terrific guy, a lot of fun to be with. It's even said that he likes beautiful women as much as I do, and many of them are on the younger side." These were clues sitting in the open. Spur-of-the-moment phrases that didn't age well. Trump keeps saying acquaintance, neighbor, friend of a friend, but even in his own words, their relationship was much closer than that. But it didn't stop there with alleged closeness found in papers, documents, and quotes. In fact, there'd be a number of third parties that would allege much worse things, some of them coming out long before Epstein's case resurfaced. One of the most jarring was from 2016, when an anonymous woman filed a lawsuit alleging that she was raped by Trump at age 13 in the mid-1990s at Epstein's Manhattan townhouse. In her lawsuit, she described raucous sex parties hosted by Epstein, where she said that Trump assaulted her on multiple occasions. The case never made it to trial, with the woman's attorney writing that multiple threats on her life had made her afraid to move forward. But Jane Doe wasn't the only one. Maria Farmer, one of Epstein's most long-running and outspoken accusers, would tell a story about a late-night visit to Epstein's office in the mid-90s where Trump arrived at the same time and started eyeing her, only for Epstein to arrive and remark, "She's not for you," to his famous friend. Trump would then allegedly say, "She looks young. I thought she was 16. And then there was Mar-a-Lago, Trump's social club that allegedly became a recruiting ground when Ghislaine Maxwell approached Virginia Jeffery, then a 16-year-old locker room attendant at the club. Jeffery would later testify that this was the beginning of the pipeline that drew her into Epstein's world, where she would eventually be trafficked to Prince Andrew, who would later pay her a $12 million settlement for his abuse. After the shock in 2019 and 2020, the Epstein story cooled off, partially because Trump was actually voted out of office around the same exact time.
Joseph R. Biden Jr. is elected the 46th president of the United States.
But when it was time for Trump to campaign again in 2024, he's faced with more questions about what he'll do about the Epstein case once he's elected.
The list of clients that went to the island has not been made public.
Probably will be, by the way.
So if you're able to, you'll be...
Yeah, I'd certainly take a look at it. Yeah, I'd be inclined to do the Epstein. I'd have no problem with it.
And he actually promises this time to release any and all files that the FBI has on Epstein.
But I'm in support of keeping it totally open. I couldn't care less. I have said to Pam and everybody else, give them everything you can give them.
And so once he was back in office after winning his second term, the public obsession with Epstein only grew even more as people waited for him to release new information.
When can we expect the Epstein documents to be released? The rest of them?
Which documents?
Epstein files?
I don't know. I'll speak to the Attorney General about that. I really don't know.
Just a month into his next term, his Attorney General says that she has the entire Epstein file sitting on her desk, ready to be released to the public. But then, it never comes.
It's sitting on my desk right now to review. That's been a directive by President Trump.
And a few months later, Trump's team announces that after exhaustive review, they found no incriminating client list or any additional documents about the case whatsoever.
Who, if anyone, did Epstein traffic these young women to besides himself?
Himself. There is no credible information. None. If there were, I would bring the case yesterday.
Even after people on the Trump team promised the opposite, they offered nothing in the way of transparency or closure. People were angry. All throughout the mainstream media, there were headlines talking about how MAGA was turning on Trump for dodging Epstein documents. There was the idea that this might be the one scandal that could fragment Trump's supporters.
How big of a blowback is there right now in MAGA world specifically?
It's pretty big, I have to be honest. And a lot of people in MAGA, they really want to know more information about the people that were involved with Jeffrey Epstein.
But instead of the answers that Trump once promised, he started not deflecting or dodging questions the way he had before, but now lashing out emotionally.
Are you still talking about Jeffrey Epstein?
While his supporters in the media would ask why exposing Epstein's network wasn't part of Trump's mission, he would brand the Epstein case as a waste of time and energy.
Department protecting any friends or donors, sir? So this is a Democrat hoax that never ends. I understand we've given thousands of pages of files, and I know that no matter what you do, it's going to keep going.
All of his responses were both highly emotional and contradictory to things he had said in the past, but the subtext was clear. He wanted the world to drop it and move on, even if that meant blaming everyone but himself. And so at the same time, perhaps because Trump so vocally rejected any transparency at all, the media's focus on Epstein would only grow stronger. In July, the controversy reached a fever pitch as the Wall Street Journal, notably owned by a conservative media conglomerate, published the contents of a note that they claimed to have taken out of a birthday album that Ghislaine Maxwell prepared for Epstein's 50th birthday back in 2003, and the album was full of notes and drawings from many of Epstein's close friends. Les Wexner, Epstein's longtime business partner and the only known client at his supposedly elite money management firm, wrote, "I wanted to get you what you want, so here it is," alongside a drawing of breasts. But of course, there was also a note from Donald Trump. It reads, "There must be more to life than everything." Donald says, "Yes, there is, but I won't tell you what it is." Jeffrey says, "Nor will I, since I also know what it is." Donald says, "We have certain things in common, Jeffrey." And Jeffrey says, "Yes, we do, come to think of it." Donald says, "Enigmas never age, have you noticed that?" And Jeffrey says, "As a matter of fact, it was clear to me the last time I saw you." And Donald says, "A pal is a wonderful thing. Happy birthday, and may every day be another wonderful secret." And the note was written within the borders of a drawing of a woman's body. And at the bottom, Donald Trump's signature was placed where her pubic hair would be. But perhaps the worst and most brazen development of all, at the height of public outrage in the summer of 2025, after things like the birthday note were made public, Trump's Justice Department sat down with Ghislaine Maxwell in prison for a 2-day interview about every aspect of her involvement in the Epstein case. And less than a week after that, the Bureau of Prisons transfers her to a minimum security prison camp. Minimum security prison camps are more lenient than most people would imagine. With dormitory-style housing instead of cells, inmates are often allowed luxuries like phones, email, weekend visits, recreational sports leagues, nearly unlimited time outside. At most prison camps, there wouldn't even be anything stopping inmates from walking out the front door and onto the street, besides the threat of more time added to their sentence if they get caught. Comparatively, it sounds pretty great. Maybe it even sounds like proper rehabilitation. But of course, the stipulation is that minimum security prison camps are typically reserved for inmates with only a few years left on their sentence, non-violent or non-sexual charges, and no past history of attempting to escape. And those are 3 qualifications that Ghislaine Maxwell does not meet. With 18 years left on her sentence, a conviction of sex trafficking, and the fact that it took a year-long manhunt to bring her in, the idea that she's fit for a prison camp with no walls around the perimeter is almost laughable. But not long after her transfer, it would all start to make sense when the DOJ released transcripts of their conversations with her. During the talks, she would claim that she never witnessed any inappropriate behavior from Donald Trump during her entire time knowing him. "I never witnessed the president in any inappropriate setting in any way. In the times I was with him, he was a gentleman in all respects." And while these quotes were obviously released to smooth over the horrible optics that followed the Wall Street Journal's notebook release, it again only worsened the PR disaster that followed each new update from the case. Because it is literally a quote from the woman who was found guilty of sex trafficking minors with Epstein. There's probably no less reliable person to ask for a quote in the entire world. The evidence has just piled up. Flight logs, address books, depositions. There was even a statue planted on the National Mall a mile from the White House that depicts Trump frolicking through the grass with Epstein. It's a monument to the world's outrage around this friendship that the president says barely existed, even though there's a mountain of proof that says the opposite. According to any logic, this could be a scandal that would destroy anyone's reputation and career forever. But the biggest problem of all is that in America today, Trump's decades-long affection and closeness for one of the most powerful pedophiles to have ever lived kind of just barely registers. And so even after years have gone by, even after getting away with it, it still does remain this albatross on the neck of the White House, this black hole on the front lawn that many millions of people just can't forget. But at the same time, people like us watching these videos, we're kind of a minority, because the most disturbing part of the Trump and Epstein story, it isn't what they did, it's what they got away with unscathed. Trump's donors are still showering him with money, and his political support remains intact. Even his opponents have pretty much decided to let it slide out of self-interest for their own careers. That's why this case is so hard to let go of. Trump could call Epstein his best friend. He could talk about the wonderful secrets they share. He could say that Epstein was a terrific guy who loves younger women. And there's no consequence for any of that. But for as long as the story remains unfinished, for as long as Epstein's friends and associates don't have to answer for themselves, it's going to remain as an open wound that represents a sickening truth about America. And that's that the rich and powerful don't have to play by the same rules as everyone else. That abuse is okay if you have enough money to make it go away. For decades, I think Americans have come to worship wealth. We kind of all believe that, to use the classic figure of speech, we all see ourselves as millionaires who haven't made it yet. And so we've come to hold the pursuit of money and the worship of wealth above actual right and wrong, out of the subconscious hope that we can someday climb the ladder and have that stability and luxury and the exotic lifestyle. I think the only problem is, though, that we've been convinced to accept our own downfall along the way. The 1980s ushered in a new era of culture and ideals. Reagan-era deregulation put the idea of the self-made man on steroids. The stock market was growing like never before, and before long, self-made wealth would become not just admirable, but it would be seen as proof of moral superiority and intelligence. We saw the rise of the idea that greed was just objectively good. The thirst to have more wealth, to control more assets, you no longer needed a reason. It was just something you could do for its own sake. The thought of living in mansions, driving exotic cars, traveling the world, it didn't need to have a purpose. In fact, in America, this type of wealth would become a virtue of its own. Being rich would be seen as proof that you were smarter, tougher, and more American than the suckers that settled for a small, quiet, safe life. Even questioning these ideals could be seen as anti-freedom and anti-capitalism. More than ever, getting money and getting a ridiculous amount of it became the American way. And that worship of money and wealth has continued to grow and take hold in America until it's grown even far, far beyond what people just 40 years ago would recognize. And today, we don't just admire wealth, we've subjected ourselves to it. In 1980, Forbes reported that there were around 13 or 14 billionaires in the US, but today that number is at almost 1,000. And the way that that affects the normal person is internalizing a worship of money above everything. The high-stakes world of stockbrokers, tech companies, development, entertainment, it's trickled down to crypto schemes, the love of exotic luxuries, the rise in consumer debt, and an obsession with not just getting rich, but looking rich. Millions of us have been trained to anticipate our own opportunity to go from rags to riches, to make millions overnight, to live our own self-made dream of Lambos, penthouses in Miami, big bust-down chains, but that's all it is, a dream. While almost 1,000 billionaires is 100 times more than there were in 1980, it's still only 0.0002% of the American population. Not even 0.003 of 1%. You're actually a lot more likely to die in a plane crash than you are to become a billionaire. But meanwhile, since 1980, the cost of living in America has also exploded. Today, we only make about double in wages compared to what we made back then, but life today costs 5 to 10 times more. While billionaires multiplied 100-fold, the middle class got stuck with skyrocketing bills and less options and freedom than we ever had before. All the while, though, this worship of money only grows. Younger generations are going into unprecedented levels of debt for luxury goods to signal wealth that most of us will never actually have. And so while we keep our eyes on the sky looking for a way to climb up and join the rich above, we've forgotten to stop and see that they only got rich because the ground underneath us is falling apart. Roads are crumbling. Schools are starving, rent is spiking, CEOs make 1 billion times more than they used to, and most of us are pretty poor. That decay that we experience and see in society around us, the lack of stability, the lack of flexibility and growth, a lot of other people on top are making money from it. That's the part that hurts. That's the system that's already decided who goes unpunished and who doesn't. It's not about just Trump or Epstein. It's about living in a country where money is more powerful than even right and wrong. Trump and Epstein were both early pioneers in this new frontier of the world of billionaires, and both of them did things throughout their career that would be simply unacceptable for anyone less wealthy. But they simply continued to push, and in the end, they had their way over and over. And the Epstein case is, in a way, the final reminder and piece of proof that shows us how much things have changed. Jeffrey Epstein carried out unthinkable horrors against hundreds of children for over 10 years, and he did it in the company of some of the world's most powerful people. Some of them, I'm sure, had no idea. Some of them were willing to turn a blind eye because of the access or funding or connections he might provide them, but some of them, they joined in. His network included intellectuals of the highest caliber, members of the royal family, actors, writers, directors, billionaires, and even presidents. But again, Trump's career rolls on like none of it ever happened. The media moves on, his deflections worked, even his political opponents don't mind letting it go. And so whether or not Epstein's story is ever resolved, I think one thing is abundantly clear. The people who hold the power aren't actually subject to its rules and regulations. And in a world where our leaders no longer even have to pretend to respect the idea of right and wrong, that's not a good omen for the future. We're supposed to trust the government to maintain the systems of freedom and justice that we want to believe in. But now, as time keeps passing, that looks more like a myth from the past than anything that ever really existed. A system where the rules mean nothing, as long as you can pay your way out of it, that's not a world you want to live in. And the idea that there's nothing off limits, not childhood innocence, not abuse of the federal justice system, the idea that right and wrong will lay down and die for things like that, it's maddening. And it's not a conspiracy. And so in a way, Epstein and Trump, the two OG billionaires, the best friends from New York, they will have forever gotten away with it. And we already see it today. It's what's happening right now. But I think ultimately, this story is about all of us. It's about our world, our trust, the people who have power over us, the accountability they don't have to face, and how that affects us. It reminds us that a society built without accountability isn't a society at all, but an illusion waiting to collapse. But all we can do right now is stay aware and refuse to forget. I'm Philip. This is Volksgeist. I really appreciate you guys supporting these videos. They're all made completely independently with no media company overlord, no one telling me what to say. And we never use AI. It's all done, human creativity, music, editing, writing, research, all done by people. And honestly, it's a very demanding process. So I started making these shirts that are reflect the topics and the themes of the video to help draw support. So if you guys want to support that, these are done on extremely high quality American blanks. We make them all in the US on our own embroidery machines. It's done by me and my team. And honestly, it's probably the most morbid, depressing YouTube merch that exists. But if you would like to wear a reminder of the reality of this story and moment in history, you can go to spiritworld.store, which is our brand, and you can get free shipping in the US on these really nice, comfortable, high quality embroidered sweatshirts and t-shirts. Again, that's spiritworld.store, and I really appreciate you guys buying my extremely morbid YouTube merch. So thanks again for watching. I appreciate the support, and I'll see you soon.